6:30 this
Oh,
one.
that's
6:29.
Host got COVID.
I'll call this July 26th study session of the Littleton City Council to order. Tonight we have one item here for discussion. It is a presentation of proposed amendments to the 2021 International Codes. I, for one, am very excited about this. Not because it's the codes, but because we've been at the Metro Mayor's Caucus. We've been talking about codes and energy codes, and every time we talk about it, Littleton's shining up there as one of the, except for Bomar, the oldest code that we've been following. So
We're gonna be working on that.
yeah. So we're trying to get as many of the communities around the Denver area to update to modern codes. And even to incentivize that was had the mayor's challenge, the Metro Mayors. So I hope we can get this done.
Got it.
Next city.
Okay, now I get it.
Now you know what the goal is. Yeah, really.
So with that, I'll turn it over to the city manager to give an introduction.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, members of the council. The city last updated its building codes in 2014, when we updated all codes other than the fire code and the National Electric Code to the 2012 version. At that time, the fire code remained on the 2009 version, and the electric code was updated to the 2014 version. The codes are published by the International Code Council on a 3-year cycle, so that with the most recent actually being adopted for 2021. So that's actually the code that we'll be talking tonight are the 2021 international codes. They're revised each cycle to adapt to changing building science and technology, and are formulated, based on input from a wide range of stakeholders, from code officials to construction industry folks to product manufacturers too. It's important that we are current with our building codes so that we can kind of ensure the highest level of safety within our built environment, and also make sure that our businesses and residents have the highest possible ISO ratings, which ensures lowest possible insurance rates in Littleton, which is important. I'll just say that many jurisdictions have engaged in numerous code updates since our last one. And we know that Denver and Aurora have already adopted 2021 versions. And most cities are currently enforcing the 2018 code. So, taking this step will help us to ensure that we have consistency with other communities and the broader construction community. And as the mayor noted, we can also be a leader in terms of adopting some of these 2021 standards. So with that, tonight we'll have a presentation from our chief building official, John Schumacher. Then we also have with us tonight Fire Marshal Anthony Valdez with South Suburban Fire and Rescue, who will have a short overview of the fire code. As we do contract, as fire, that is the responsibility of South Suburban. So we're really just seeking your questions and your discussion tonight on the code, and ultimately we're seeking your direction to bring these codes back for eventual consideration for adoption at an upcoming meeting. With that, I'll turn it over to our chief building code official, John. Take it away.
Mecklenburg. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to present. As the city manager said, we're here to talk about proposed amendments to the 2021 international codes. This is our first process since 2014. This is the fourth process that I've engaged in my position as building official, and I look forward to discussing these proposed amendments with you this evening. So I guess I will start with a little bit of history in terms of the city of Littleton and the I-codes. As I said, our last adoption process was in 2014. We adopted the 2012 code. Since then, they have published the 2015, 18, and now the 21 versions of the codes. When we adopted the 2012 codes, there were a significant number of amendments that we enacted at that time. Most of those made the codes more restrictive than they were in their base form. We started in 2018 the process to adopt the 2018 codes, and that carried on into 2019. But there were some personnel changes during that time, and the process was a little bit atypical of what I've seen before in my experience. So when I started on, we were at a point in the process where I felt like the 21s were getting ready to come out. We wanted to be as current as possible, and so we halted that 2018 process for a few months, waited for the 2021 versions to come out, and started that process over so that we are on the most recent version. And we hope to complete that with this body by the end of this year. We are proposing in our adoption process the adoption of all of the same codes that we currently enforce, with the exception of the existing building code. That is a code we're recommending that we add and adopt as a part of our process. The codes that are currently enforced and that we are proposing to adopt are the International Building Code, the Residential Code, the Plumbing Code, Mechanical Code, the Fuel Gas Code, Energy Conservation Code, the Fire Code, the Property Maintenance Code, the latest version of the National Electrical Code, the 2020, and then the Uniform Code for the Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. And as I said, we would also propose adding the existing building code and a few appendices to each of those codes. And we'll kind of cover that a little bit as we go through.
So there's been no better practices with the abatement of dangerous buildings in the last 25 years?
There really hasn't. It has been, that's the last complete published version. It had been broken into pieces, severed into different areas and included in the other codes, but having it as a comprehensive standalone code is beneficial to us in enforcement, especially when dealing with dangerous buildings, derelict buildings, things like that. And it is a code that other jurisdictions around us also maintain.
I will say, just for edification, that about a year and a half ago, we introduced a new code to enable us to place municipal liens on properties in which we've abated, which is kind of one of those small loopholes that existed between the 1997 code and what we have. So.
Okay, so a little bit about our adoption process.
Which we have been successful at recovering some certain costs. I know that
We have.
There's a couple of properties in which we've had to go in and remediate in terms of demoing, and we have recouped costs on at least one of those thus far.
I hope to, moving forward, maybe do a little bit better with that process. I think through the legal process, I think that we have an opportunity to handle that differently through the court system and leverage a little bit better compliance so that we don't get to that point of abatement. But it's nice to have that 97 uniform code to use if we do get to that point. So we started this process, as I said, in 2020. As the 21s began to come out. We held a contractors meeting earlier this month, at the beginning of the month, and we presented all of these same amendments to the contractors. We spoke with BBOA, our Building Board of Appeals, last week.
How
Yes,
many contractors were there?
there were 11 total people, there were 3 contractors. We did send out the amendments to 2,600 contractors via email and solicited comment from them. We have not received one response. We haven't received any more than one response. And the one response was just that there were no objections. I didn't see anything that was unusual in our process. So we talked to the Building Board of Appeals last week. We are here this evening. We hope to go through this conversation with you this evening, make any adjustments that we need to make to our proposal, take that next month to the Building Board of Appeals for a resolution of support, and then come back to you with the amendments and some Title IV changes that are required to implement the amendments in October, and then for second reading and adoption in November. So as I go through this, please feel free to stop me and ask questions. I'll try. Sometimes when I talk about code, I can get a little excited and just buzz through it. So, because I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. So please stop me if there are any questions as I go or if I'm going a little too fast. So one of the things that we did in our previous process was in Title IV, we created administrative provisions within Title IV and deleted those administrative provisions that exist within the codes themselves, but only for certain codes. I can't really tell you what the reasoning was for that, but certain codes were, the administrative provisions were maintained, others were referred to parts of Title IV. What we have decided to do in conjunction with the City Attorney's Office was to adopt the codes fully intact and maintain the administrative provisions that are within those codes as they are printed. The administrative provisions are very similar, almost identical, but not quite, very similar in all of those codes. So we made some administrative amendments that are applicable to all of those codes. And I'll go over those fairly quickly. Each of those codes has a section that provides for annual permits, in which a property owner can buy a single permit and use that permit for a year to do any type of work that they would like to do under that permit. That's a very difficult thing to monitor and to properly track inspections, to properly value, other things like that. So we have proposed the deletion of that annual permits section, and you get a permit each time you do an individual project. We coordinated the work exempt from permit sections. In the amendments that we proposed, every code exempts certain types of work. It varies slightly between those codes. The wording is a little different. There's a slight variation in each of those lists. What we did was to coordinate those lists so that they are the same in each of the codes, so that no matter which code you reference, you're looking at the same information, and it's a lot clearer for our code users. One of the things that exists in the codes is an exemption for fences and decks under certain conditions. We have removed those exemptions based on requirements within the ULUC. All fences and decks would require a permit. Also in coordination with the ULUC, sheds under 120 square feet and less than 8 feet would be exempt from permit. In the body of the code, it just says sheds under 120 square feet of floor area. It doesn't talk about height, but the ULUC does. So we made an amendment that also clarifies that height so that it coordinates with the ULUC. One of the bigger changes that we made in the code is permits are typically good for 180 days. They expire after 180 days if there's no activity. And so what has traditionally happened is people can buy a permit, it's good for 180 days, and if they call for inspection anytime in that 180 days, it's automatically extended. And that is why we have some projects that have gone on for 7 or 8 or 9 years that I'm sure some of you are aware of. And what happens is they just call in an inspection once every 6 months, and the system automatically generates an extension. And it's a little hard for us to monitor because it's set up that way. By changing that time frame to 365 days and removing the automatic extension by inspection, that gives all of our permit holders, for the most part, other than commercial projects, most other projects should be able to be completed in a year. A house, a basement finish, an addition, those 365 days is typical. It doesn't mean that we can't extend their permit, but it just prevents it from being automatically extended by the inspection, and it gives us a little control over that so that we can work to ensure that we're not having those projects that go on for numerous years and that we get complaints about through our code enforcement division. The other thing that we did that's in all of the codes, an amendment that we have proposed, is permit valuation to include the value of all work. The way it's stated within the codes as written, the valuation portion in each of the codes varies a little bit again, and it doesn't necessarily include all work. And it's really difficult when we're working with customers who are doing remodeling work or tenant finish work, things like that, other than new work. It's really difficult to value that work in a consistent way, right? We ask them to state the value, but then we're also supposed to verify that value against typical industry information and market information that we have. But that can be difficult to do. Determining which portions may be permittable and not permittable, what are applicable to the code. So it works a little easier for us, and it's a little fairer in our system when working with our customers to just say, what's the value of all of your work? What's your contract price on this?
Is there an estimate in regard to the increase or decrease of permanent revenues based upon that new evaluation?
No, we've been doing the valuations similar to this, we're just clarifying it. And the valuation for new work is established using a table that's published by the International Code Council, the folks that publish these codes. They put something out twice a year, typically February and September. Gives you a square foot cost and a modifier for our area. To give you an example right now, it's always low, even using the modifier. And using the modifier, it says that right now, the average square foot valuation for residential property in Colorado is about $170 a square foot. We all know that's low based on market value, but we have, over the last couple of years, tried very hard to make sure we're using that updated valuation data and that we are applying it consistently for all new work. And then asking for these valuations to be stated similar to what we're proposing within the language. This language, our language varies just slightly, but this is the same language that's been in our code even since the 2012 adoption. It does say, it specifies all finish work, but we clarified and just said all work.
How often are we updating the new ICC tables?
Twice a year. So typically February, March, and September, October is when they come out.
Is that pretty standard to do the valuation in the industry? Are there other methods, like just a flat fee for a bathroom remodel or a basement or whatever it is? Because, you could have someone have a 6x10 bathroom or whatever size and put all high-end finishes in, or go completely, all go to Habitat for Humanity, all low stuff. The effort for the city doing those is pretty much the exact same for the inspections, but I don't know.
So it's typical to use this valuation data, and in terms of how we would value a bathroom remodel, there's some industry data out there. There are some numbers that say this is your average, and we don't want to overcharge someone, right? We don't want to overvalue a project. So, and I think that's kind of same. It kind of ties into that square foot value for residential. That's a little low. We would rather go a little low than charge someone more than we should. There are flat fees in some municipalities, typically for smaller projects, water heaters, air conditioners, those smaller type furnaces. There's a flat fee of $50 to $100 for the permit plus use tax. That is, quite honestly, something we plan to come back with after we get through this adoption process and have an opportunity to work on our licensing ordinance also. We have our fee schedule that we've put together, but we'll come back with a proposal to go to that flat fee. And I need to do some research in terms of cost, especially with the inflation, staff cost, so that I can be assured that when we set a fee, that it's covering our costs, at least for those smaller projects. And doing that, quite honestly, the permit winds up being about $20 difference between using the fee table that we have and using a flat fee. It's about $20 cheaper. But even that $20 and that consistency does promote better compliance in obtaining permits for those smaller projects. So that is something we will come back with. And there'll be, I anticipate, 6 to 8 project types that we'll propose a flat fee for. And we need to do the analysis in terms of revenue changes based on that and make sure that we have all of that information to present.
John, I understand the no automatic extension by inspection, but what's the difference between deleting annual permits and then allowing annual permits?
So allowing an annual permit it'll make it difficult to value that permit, right? We don't know when we issue the annual permit what type of work you would do.
It's not just a 365-day permit, it's just a general permit rather than like a permit for a bathroom remodel that's good for 365 days. That's just a blanket, you can do stuff in your house.
Yeah, so an annual permit will say for the next 365 days, you can do any work you would like, right? And so
So the other one is specific to a project.
that's correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we're reviewing by the end of the year, right, that fee schedule?
Yes.
Right, okay. When is it?
Is that, Reed, is that part of budget, fees?
Usually is.
Sure it is.
Maybe I should ask Sama. Sama, is that part of fees? The fees part of the budget, or is that separate action?
Part of the budget process, it's brought as an ordinance later in the year, resolution later in the year.
Okay, any questions before I
You might
move on?
repeat that just so folks at home heard Sama.
Sure, so the question was asked about fees and when those would come before city council, and that's part of the budget by ordinance. Resolution.
Good job, Jennifer.
So another administrative amendment that we made was that gives us the authority to require preliminary inspections prior to issuance of a permit. That is in a few of the codes, but not all of them. You know, and honestly, if you have an opportunity to watch the code hearings, which are coming up, and you can watch those for free, and folks, if you
This is exciting.
So, folks in the building industry will tell you it's like watching sausage be made. You do it once, you never want to do it again, right? So somehow and sometimes those things get missed, where it goes in some codes and not others. This change just makes it applicable throughout all of the codes. And the reason it's important to have is right now, we already do this, and folks typically will comply, but we will find someone doing a fix and flip or some other sort of basement finish project or something like that, where we need to go in and review the scope of work to know for sure how to structure their permit and their inspections. And this gives us the authority to say, before we issue your permit, we need to look to make sure that we're issuing your permit and your inspection list properly. The only other significant administrative amendment is to the penalty sections. In each of the codes, it has a penalty section, and you fill in the blanks. So we filled that in to reference our city code as it relates to penalties for work without permit or other violations. All right, we'll get into the codes. One thing, I guess, before we start talking about the larger technical amendments to the codes is we tried to minimize those as much as possible. We had a lot of technical amendments in our 2012 process. As I said earlier, a lot of those amendments made the code more restrictive, increased separation ratings and other things like that that are costly to contractors. The codes are, for the most part, very scientific. There's a lot of data and testing to back the codes. We felt like we could leave the codes pretty much as written and just make the most minimal number of amendments to make sure that it accommodates what we need here in Littleton. So one of those amendments is to group R3 occupancies. The code requires in the building code, it requires sprinkler systems in single-family homes, duplexes, although folks in building codes don't like you to call them duplexes, two-family homes, and townhouses. Our initial proposal was to exempt all three of those, single-family, two-family, and townhomes from the sprinkler requirement. Feedback that we received from someone at the contractors meeting, and then feedback that I received after the Building Board of Appeals meeting asked that I change that and ask you to consider exempting one and two family dwellings, but not townhouses. And the reasoning that was presented to me for that is townhouses are separated by 2-hour walls. And they also have fire protection 4 feet out from those 2-hour walls. But there are times when homeowners or contractors will do work in those dwellings and will penetrate those 2-hour walls. They'll run cable, they'll run phone line, they'll do other things where they penetrate those walls, leaving some vulnerability. And sprinkler systems would address that vulnerability. So that was the reasoning that I received, and along with the request to remove that exemption for townhomes in my presentation this evening. One of the other amendments that we made to the building code was to require ice barrier on roofs. That's already a requirement that we have. That's commonly in construction referred to as ice and water shield. It prevents ice damming at the bottom of the roof. That is something that has been in place for us for a long time, and that the vast majority of jurisdictions around us use. The other thing that we proposed for amendment was the overlay of asphalt shingles. The code is kind of unclear in the way it's written. It says that you can't put a second layer of asphalt shingles on a roof under certain conditions, but they're very subjective conditions, where it might not be an adequate base, where it might be subject to rain or water soaking or deterioration. Those things are really they're subjective. They're hard sometimes to determine in a fair way and be consistent. And when the codes addressed this a long time ago, there were a lot of 3-tab shingles. And those types of shingles were flat. They overlaid each other fairly well. They flat shingle on a flat shingle. Most homes now have dimensional shingles, and putting a dimensional shingle over another shingle, it has voids in there. It won't look good, and it won't adhere as well or maintain that adherence. So we've proposed this amendment in both the building code, and you'll see that we've also proposed it for the residential code. The only other significant technical amendment is adoption of Appendix J, which addresses grading. And that is something that we are proposing in conjunction with our Public Works Department. Questions about the building code?
Grading as far as measurement from grade to roof peak, or what?
Grading in general, right? Slope, some permitting and administrative provisions, but slope, detention, some other things like that.
If you're looking for opinion on the not townhomes, I would include townhomes in this also. I don't think I put a sprinkler system in a townhome. It's just so costly to put in. So I would be in favor of treating a townhome just like a single family.
And I would be looking for direction on that from this board. I can tell you that the average cost for a sprinkler system, based on information that I just read from the National Association of Home Builders, is between $4,600 and $6,300 in a residential property. So that is the added cost for a residential sprinkler, an NFPA 13R.
What's does our neighbors do? What does Centennial do? What does Highlands Ranch do, Anthony?
So Centennial does require townhomes, but not 1 and 2 family dwellings.
Okay,
City of Lone Tree does townhomes. City of Castle Pines does townhomes.
so that's pretty consistent then.
Mhm.
I guess I should ask that question first. I just want to stay consistent with what our neighbors are doing. You know, that's always been a big complaint I've heard is you guys are outdated on your code. You're using old code, and you know you're not consistent with the other neighborhoods. So, yeah, so I'd be okay if the other ones are doing townhomes, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think that information. I'm good with that.
I'm in the same boat as well, like just do what our neighbors do.
Thank you.
It's not so cost prohibitive, we're not gonna get people not building townhomes because of that.
I mean, $6,000, but on a $300,000 or $400,000, no, it's.
Yeah.
Well, that'd be on two, townhomes. That's probably, that's per unit. So
Well, yeah, per unit,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
I think it's pretty expensive.
All right, so we'll move to the residential code. There is a table within the residential code that is blank. in the code, and you fill in the design criteria. That's wind load, snow load, frost depth, other things like that. So that's the first amendment that we made, was just to fill in that chart using information that's contained within the codes. They have maps and other information that's contained in there, and then also from the National Weather Service in terms of average temperature, things like that. So that's the first big amendment that we made, is we filled in that chart. The next amendment was the removal of sprinklers from 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses, same as in the building code, but now we've been asked to propose that same amendment, and that we keep townhouses in the sprinkler requirement. Another amendment that we made on residential is pathways for solar panels on roofs. The way it's done right now in the code, in the base language that's in there, is again, it's sort of, it can be very confusing both for inspectors and for contractors that are doing installation. It will say that if less than 33% of the panels or 33% of the roof are covered in panels, then one pathway is required, and then if between 33 and 66% of the roof is covered, then there's one pathway on the front, one pathway on the back. It's set up that way where it's difficult. The inspector would have to sit out there and calculate, right? Are we at 65%? Are we at 66%? And so what we've proposed, and at times it's an 18-inch clearance from the edges of the roof. Other times it's 36 inches. So what we've proposed that is 3 feet around the edges and 2 pathways on the street side of the roof. And by doing this allows 2 access points for responders when they, first responders when they come, if they need to go on the roof. It allows 3 feet all the way around, so that allows for workers that are servicing the panels or installing the panels, or inspectors or others, adequate access all the way around all of the panels. And also at the ridge of the roof, there would be 3 feet. Right now it's 18 inches if you're covered a certain portion, and then bumps to 36. So we thought that by making this amendment, it makes it very clear and consistent. No matter how many panels you're putting on, these are your requirements. We want 2 pathways, and we want 3 feet all the way around on all edges, so that we have adequate access. We have the exact same amendment for ice barrier as we did in the building code. We have the exact same amendment for regarding overlay of asphalt shingles, as we did in the we did in the building code. Another thing that we addressed in the residential code, it not only addresses structural provisions, it also talks about plumbing, mechanical, electrical. We amended the gas test pressure to be 10 pounds per square inch instead of 3. That coincides with the state's requirement under the plumbing code. And then we amended the time from 10 minutes to 15 minutes. It's been an industry standard to do 10 pounds, 15 minutes for at least 20 years. So that's, we made that coincide with the state requirements.
But not in Littleton.
Actually, that's correct, not Littleton. It was, I think we had 20 pounds in our amendment, so. We filled in the blank. Minimum sewer depth is set at the frost depth, which is 36 inches. There's quite a few fill in the blanks in the code, right? That you provide the information based on your jurisdiction and weather conditions within your jurisdiction. The other thing that we are proposing is adoption of appendices AC and AQ. AC is exit terminals, which is where exhaust exits the building. So if you're exhausting your furnace, you're exhausting other hazardous or environmental air, it's actually, a lot of that's already in the code, but this is a diagram. The whole appendix is just a diagram that says this is how far you have to be from different openings based on where you are located and what you're exhausting. So we propose the adoption of that just for clarity and clarification for our users. And then Appendix AQ is tiny homes. It's tiny houses. It is, it's very minimal, but it's right now the only the only guidance that's out there that we can adopt in this fashion. The state is working on a state level tiny homes code, and it's anticipated to be done next year. But this will give us some guidance between now and then, and if there's any delay in that process, this will give us some guidance in helping folks who want to bring tiny homes.
Good to be proactive in the code here. I did have a question on the sprinklers. Is there anything, and I know with the 1 and 2 family homes that it's, added expense and it's not, something that people tend to do, or at least in the past. Is there something we could do to incentivize that in the code somehow? I don't know how removing that from the valuation of the permit. I know that's probably real small, but if there's, something that's.
Anthony can speak to that only because I was on the board at South Metro and how they try to incentivize homeowners. Do you remember that report kinda?
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't go over very favorable.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. We were basically rebating 3 years of property taxes from our mill levy to homeowners to incentivize. Also, our fee schedule currently incentivizes houses under 6,000 square feet. It's $100 permit fee for all those homes under 6,000, and then it goes up off of that. So we felt that the majority of the average size home would be under that 6,000 threshold, that we could help incentivize that. So that still is current, and no plans to change that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of something small, because there are people that want that for peace of mind themselves, and if there was just, some way to.
Was the incentive, does it come back through insurance? Your homeowner's insurance, because you have a sprinkler system, that you get a discount, so over time you eventually pay it off, but.
It depends on the insurance company. So we have found 2 different perspectives on that. One, insurance providers feel like it's an increased risk to water damage. So they don't necessarily look at it as a great reduction. And then others see it as, we'd much rather pay a water claim than a fire claim, because there's usually more mass damage in a fire scenario. So it's kind of depends on where that lies in the insurance carrier. Can I throw one other idea that we've used? I will give the disclaimer that it hasn't been ultra successful, but in a couple of our other cities, we have proposed, and it's been supported by their councils, to do what's been nicknamed as the mandatory option. And so it requires builders to provide the option so that they have engaged fire sprinkler contractors. They have designs laid out similar as you would in any other kind of tract home, options of countertops and increased bathroom sizes and those types of things. And it just allows contractors and such to ensure the homeowners are educated on that being an opportunity for them to provide that. Oftentimes we find a lot of people just don't know that that's aware. Yeah, they're just not aware of the opportunity to do so. But that's another one that we have tried to use. Again, it hasn't been ultra successful, but we have gotten a few here and there to engage in doing so.
How does that work?
So one example, the city of Castle Pines, that's where that's adopted. It's one of our first cities that did it. And so the home builder, at the sales, when they're negotiating the contract for the home, just like all the other option lists that they provide a sprinkler option and walk the homeowner through the benefits of that and so forth. And then there, it's a little bit more codified that the homeowner, the potential home buyer, needs to sign a document stating that they have been educated on it, and that either they want to elect to install it or they want to not install it. And then those forms are tracked, and we keep track of that data and so forth. So that's one option. We do know that there are several home builders in the Castle Pines area, specifically the canyons, that have pre-designed all of their model homes with sprinkler systems. So they are legit ready to go if somebody were to elect for that too.
So the one thing I'll say is that that works. I see that working well with the larger production builders. That's probably a little harder for us to police in some way when we are dealing with infills, the homeowners who wanna build their own. That's just a little tougher to monitor. So that's just something to consider. Other questions about the residential code?
No.
The rest of these will go quicker, I promise.
I can't promise that.
As you can see, they're gonna go a little quicker. We have one amendment proposed for the International Mechanical Code. That's the adoption of Appendix A, chimney connector pass-through. What that is it talks a little bit about existing masonry chimneys and how you can use metal venting like you have on your typical 80% furnace, and how to run that through your masonry chimney. That we don't have a lot of that here, but we do have a little bit of that, and you have that in jurisdictions, and the code never really has addressed that well. And so that is something that's been put in the appendix and that we're proposing for adoption, just so if we come across that, we have some clear guidelines for our customers to work from and for us to inspect from. The only amendment we're proposing to the International Plumbing Code is the same as the amendment that we used in the International Residential Code, setting the sewer depth at 36 inches below grade, which is our frost depth.
Sean, is that been pretty standard when these homes were all built, 36 inches or
Yes.
30?
What was the one we just found in Prince, 10 inches?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about
We get the odd ones once in a
Yeah.
while, but yes, most are at 36 and some are at 30.
Yeah.
They vary in there, but
I presume that's the wall of the house. Cause it goes down after that.
Right.
So it's at the house, the measurement, right?
yes. Questions about either of those? All right, fuel gas code. The only two amendments we have are ones that you've already seen. The gas test pressure, we amended that so it would coincide with our amendment in the residential code. And we are proposing the adoption of Appendix A, which is again the chimney connector pass-through. And that is the same as the one we had before. All right, International Energy Conservation Code. We are not proposing any amendments to the Energy Conservation Code. We're proposing adoption of the 2021 as written.
I've warned you about this, so in regard to the IECC, there's a number of energy efficiency kind of requirements. Can you walk council through maybe some of the highlights in terms of what might be required through the IECC, which would not have been required 15, 20 years ago?
It's a good thing there's an Avs game on tonight.
I'm sorry. I mean, no, I mean,
Go through the change.
To be fair, there's been some discussions regarding the Marshall burn and the Marshall fire and some of the increased costs that have been placed on homeowners. Just wanted to get it out in public in terms of what those might be.
So.
They're being waived, aren't they?
Pardon?
Aren't they being waived?
I think Superior might have done it.
Yeah.
They are, and a lot of those increased costs were actually related to the Urban Wildlife Interface Code that required that you have non-combustible materials on the exterior of your home, things like that. So folks who had wood siding and are trying to rebuild and wanted to rebuild with wood siding were being forced to upgrade by the code. So those code requirements have been waived because of the additional cost that was coming from those upgrades. And the fact that some insurance companies were not covering the upgrades. In terms of the Energy Conservation Code, the Colorado Energy Office did a study. They have not gotten to the 2021 code, but they did a study that showed what it would cost for the average home to move from a particular year to the 2018 version, which was at that time the most recent version. To move from the 2012 code to the 2018 code was about $600 in additional cost. Estimates for a move from the 2018 to the 2021 code range from around $3,000 to $5,000. And the reason being partly is inflation, right? And that this is a recent study, and so costs have, and especially here in Colorado, this is the Colorado Energy Office, so the cost has really increased since they did their study on the 2018. But also there are additional requirements for insulation in the attic. There are additional requirements for insulation in the exterior envelope in the walls, wrapping of ducting. Interestingly, you can still use an 80% furnace. That's, that it's interesting because in the 2015, really, there became this kind of industry myth that you can no longer put in an 80% furnace. And the code very clearly says that you can. So it's not, those costs don't necessarily come from mechanical upgrades. They come mostly they stem from insulation requirements. Insulation of ductwork in non-conditioned spaces. So in your crawl space, lots of ductwork runs through there for a long time. The code didn't require that, and even when it did, it was fairly lenient, and a lot of jurisdictions didn't enforce that. Those requirements.
There are window requirements too, right?
The window requirements are actually the same as what we have now.
Really?
The window requirements in 2012 said that you had to have a U factor of 0.32 or less, and we amended that to 0.30, and the 2021 code is 0.30. So it's really, even though it's a change in the body of the code, it's not a change for us. It's what we've been enforcing since 2012.
City attorney had something?
Limit on the number of questions one person can ask.
I was gonna get that to you. Councilmember Meyer was like, he
Plus
was
for
out there.
comments.
Have there been studies as to an estimated kind of return as to when that catches up in regard to cost versus how long?
There has, and so the Colorado Energy Office also did that, and as I said, they only went through the 2018, but to move from the 2012 to the 2018, it was estimated 1.5 years return on your money. It was $600 in costs, but in a year and a half's time, you would save $600.
What would that be today, would you?
With increased energy costs, I would think.
In 20 years.
Yeah, it costs
No, it costs 3 months to
Yes.
recoup. Just because of how expensive gas is, you put it in, it's gonna cost up front. But the heating and insulation saves you so much. Cost of money today is a lot more than it is 10
So-
years from now.
Unofficially, some of the things that I've read, there's not been studies done yet because the 21 is newer. But things that I've read have said between 4 to 6 years, even with that increased cost, 4 to 6 years, you would recoup all of the cost. That $3,000 to $5,000 would only take 4 to 6 years to recoup.
Okay, moving on.
I got a in the weeds question on the property maintenance code. When I was going through and just seeing the section on weeds.
So my
We gotta get
wheelhouse.
that implemented immediately.
8
for us.
inches seems low.
Well, so it says, 8 inches for weeds, but it includes all grasses, and I'm thinking a lot of people that are moving towards native grasses. If someone has bunch grasses or native grasses that are over 8 inches, you could have a neighbor that is unhappy with you, and if you have native grasses that are,
That's not considered a weed.
literally it says includes all grasses.
It's
So,
a weed.
so I just wanted to figure out how we would figure that out.
Actually say grass.
So my experience has been over my 20-some years in the business that weeds, people don't treat grass as weeds, and they don't, I understand it says that in there, and if you would like, I'd be happy to amend it so that it clearly states only
could-
weeds.
We could certainly provide a definition of weeds that are more of the noxious definition that would be
Yeah, just 'cause
by
this-
state law. I can certainly do that.
Literal reading of this, someone could say, okay, it only excludes flowers and cultivated gardens, and you can make the argument that a field of native grasses is not a cultivated garden, but.
We'll
catch,
place a
good catch,
definition for weeds that are,
Okay, great, that's all.
yeah, we can do that.
And there is a definition already in the code, right, so, but we can clarify that we, in some way, that we're
Not a
only
huge
looking
thing,
at-
but just something I
Weeds, not Kyle Schlachters.
not my yard.
We got it.
We'll take it.
All right, so other amendments to the property maintenance code, and you will see a couple of these also in the existing building code. Insect screens required year-round. The code says insect screens are required from date to date, and you fill in the dates. From an enforcement standpoint, from a determination of what's the appropriate date to start and stop, and don't we sometimes needs, it's Colorado, we can in January have a few days of 70 degrees. So we just said screens are required, basically. It's year round, it just says screens are required.
I'm not familiar with insect screen.
Just a screen on your
Screen
window,
on your window.
right? So window screens. And I guess one of the things that came up at the Building Board of Appeals that I want to clarify is this and the heat required year round would typically be used in a rental property situation. When we get a complaint from a tenant that says, I haven't had heat for a week, we have no intention of driving around proactively in neighborhoods and going, oh, there's a house without screens, right? Or addressing the heat requirement unless it's a complaint that we receive. And there are other portions of this code that address habitability, and that's also based on heat and the ability to have heat and maintain heat at 68 degrees, 2 feet off the floor, 3 feet in off the walls. It just seemed, both said fill in a date, and it just seemed a little clearer and a little more consistent just to say you have to have heat, you have to have screens.
Is the screens only for windows that lead into a house, or does that also include windows that might lead into a garage?
I would treat that as screens that lead into habitable structures, so.
So a apartment complex that closes off the heat early and then there's a cold spell, they're not in compliance? I mean, they could be,
So
get a
even with,
penalty?
yes, what we do is we'd call them and we'd say it's cold out, you should be able to have heat, right? And again, there's another section in here that also addresses that. The interior temperature should be able to be maintained at 68 degrees or higher. So that portion of the code would apply with or without this amendment. This just clarifies that it's not particular dates that they have to provide heat. I'm not sure why there's two sections in there. One that says provision of heat during these times, and then another that says you have to maintain 68 degrees, but.
So if and somebody told me in a senior community over Windermere, they weren't getting heat and they were, literally under blankets and stuff, they could call the city in this, okay.
They could, and we would contact the office and
let them
say,
know.
we have a code requirement that says that you have to be able to maintain 68 degrees. And we would ask them to address that in some way. So I skipped over handrail and guardrail requirements that are coordinated with the IBC and the IRC. So with the building code and the residential code, the handrail height requirements are the same, the guardrail requirements are the same. In the International Property Maintenance Code, it says that handrails can be anywhere between 30 inches high and 42 inches high. Everywhere else it says 34 to 38 inches high, and that's based on some science. Because it's a life safety issue, in terms of being able to use a handrail on stairs or having a guardrail on stairs, we felt it appropriate to make an amendment that just coordinates it with the IBC and the IRC so that all of the codes read the same way. And you'll see that amendment also in the existing building code. And this last one on this list, egress and aisles required to comply with the IFC, IBC, and IRC. Right now, what the property maintenance code says is egress and aisles, so ways of getting in and out of buildings, have to comply with the fire code. But anymore, the fire code and the building code and the residential code are pretty well coordinated. And so we just added language that allows us to also reference the building code and residential code, which is under our jurisdiction, and the fire code is typically under South Metro's jurisdiction. And here we are at the International Existing Building Code. So we have the insect screens, the handrail and guardrail requirements. They both read exactly the same as we just had in the Property Maintenance Code. The heat required year-round is the same. The egress and aisles required to comply are the same. The amendment that we made to egress windows, based on replacement egress windows, is designed to clarify the requirement. In the International Existing Building Code right now, it says that the replacement window, it's really strange, but it basically says it has to be the biggest opening or the biggest window that will fit the opening. Right. Right, exactly. That's confusing, right? So one of the things that's kind of been in place for a long time when replacing windows in bedrooms or egress windows in your basement where you're not compliant with egress requirements is you just can't be less compliant with your new window. You don't have to be fully compliant, right? Because sometimes that requires changing the style of the window or changing the opening to become fully compliant. So people would not get a permit to replace their windows. What our amendment says is you can't, it clarifies that you can't reduce the existing egress. We want to know what your existing window is and what the egress is, and we want you to have at least the same level of egress that you had before you replaced the window, hopefully better, and you become fully compliant. But it allows us to be very clear with our customers what we're looking for. And there's not that ambiguity, and they don't make that face that you made when I said what the code says. So, and then the other amendment to the International Existing Building Code is change of occupancy requires permit and inspection. That's also something that's in the code, but it's not very clear right now. This just is clarifying language that says when you're changing one business in a structure to a different business, we come out and take a look. It's a way to address life safety issues and other concerns, and also to document those changes and issue new certificates of occupancy. And I'll step back just a little bit because the existing building code is new, and the reason we're proposing the adoption of the existing building code, anyone who's familiar with building code knows that for a long time there's been a trigger point in the code of 50%. If you're doing work on a building, that's 50%, and it's not 50% of the building, but 50% of the value. If the value of the work is 50% or more of the value of the building, then that triggers compliance with the codes as if it was a new building. First off, it's very difficult, as we talked about before, to value. How do you value the building? Who values the building? Who values the work? How do you do that? That's all very subjective. The International Existing Building Code was designed to kind of address that. And there are different levels of alteration within these codes. So instead of just saying if you're over 50% of the value, what it says is if you're doing this type of work, it's a level 1 alteration, and only these things need to comply with code. If you're doing level 2, then these things need to comply with code, and you may need to do some level of upgrade to your life safety components. And there are different levels in there. And so it makes it a little clearer when to implement those unintended changes. When someone came in and they were like, I didn't know I had to do that. A simple example is smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors, right? There are requirements say when you do interior work. But you know, what's interior work? Some things aren't permitted or permittable, right? And so the existing building code was created and designed to sort of address those things in a clearer way. And it will help us with a lot of our existing structures downtown especially, right? There are a lot of those, historic structures are, with the exemption of some life safety components, are generally exempt from compliance with the building code. But ones that aren't historic but still have a lot of older components, 8-inch rise on the stairs with only a 9-inch tread, things like that. This will help to address those things and in a way that a smaller project won't trigger those larger changes and those more costly changes. And it's kind of sets some trigger levels for a level of investment, not only monetarily, but just in the scope of work before it triggers some upgrades that maybe weren't anticipated. So it's a code that's being adopted pretty widely throughout the metro area. It's been around for a few cycles now, and it's worked well in other jurisdictions, and that's why I'm proposing that we adopt that. I think that would be very helpful to us in addressing a lot of our existing buildings, and like I said, especially our downtown area.
Question that probably deals with this and probably the fire code next. Going back to the sprinklers in the past with an existing building, like let's just call it a large multifamily apartment or whatever it is that it doesn't have sprinklers. I guess in the past it was if it's greater 50% threshold, they don't have to install the sprinklers to get the code. Is there any way, or would there be ways to, require sprinklers to go in, let's say that they're doing work because of a fire? I mean,
So the existing building code is not that specific in terms of what the purpose, or what what initiated the work, in terms of whether it was a fire or not. But it does have those levels in there, and the scope of the work, a lot of times, that would be required to address a previous fire, that scope of work would, in the existing building code, then trigger that, right? It's based more on the scope of work, rather than just whatever caused the need for that scope of work. So there's not anything in the code that says, oh, you had a fire, you have to upgrade. It's not that clear cut. But oftentimes the result of the fire and the work that is required does provide that trigger for the upgrade.
Not all the time.
Not all the time, no.
Can you think of an example?
Just off the top of my head, I can. So I'm just trying to, think about that possibility of, fire causing work, it doesn't hit the threshold of requiring sprinklers and it just, doesn't look good.
So one of the things that exists in the code, in existing structures that will be helpful in the existing building code, it used to be in existing structures way back in the uniform code, is there is a formulaic process to address fire safety and rate a building for fire safety. And so I'll be honest with you, I used it when I first became a building official, and on a lot of older buildings, older than 1970, if you wanted to use that and fill it out completely, you would find that most of them do not meet the level of fire protection necessary. And it would then allow you to use that in a somewhat subjective way to negotiate with the owners for safety upgrades, whether that's alarm and notification, whether that's full sprinkling, and the score, you basically get a score using that document and coming up with a score. You could take that score and use it as a tool to negotiate. I mean, you could use it to require full compliance. We of course would want to. Sometimes full compliance is very difficult from a financial standpoint and from a structural and physical standpoint within the building. But it is a tool that we can use, and that is included in the existing building code.
Questions?
All right, it's Anthony's turn. I'm going to talk a little about fire code. Let me pull up his presentation.
Actually, I think Caitlin's. is Caitlin on?
It looks easy.
I thought so. All right, Jen, how do I do this? Over here.
This is so fancy
I'll get
background.
started. Thank you all for having me tonight. Most of this is a little bit unique in that this is the first time that us as a fire district are before you in adopting a fire code. So a little bit of what we're trying to accomplish is one, we also are a big philosophy of not wanting to over amend the code. We believe in the model process that occurs for the code to be built to begin with. But there are a handful of areas where, as John was saying, there's like fill in the blanks and just providing better clarity to our customers so that they don't have to guess or constantly reach out to find out the information. And then with that also being said, a big philosophy is for us to be as consistent as possible throughout all of the jurisdictions that we protect. It's one of the big initiatives of what we were trying to accomplish through the varying unifications that we've done with varying fire departments is create that consistency for our customer and a greater span so that we can provide what we feel is a little bit higher level service across multiple areas. With that being said, it's still your fire code that you're adopting and just delegating us the authority to enforce it. as the fire protection experts that we are. So with that being said, our administrative amendments are very similar to that, is just filling in the blanks, designating one that the fire code is the fire code of the city of Littleton. It's enforceable within the city legal boundaries of Littleton. We adopt appendices B, which is our fire flow requirements, appendix C, fire hydrant locations, and appendix D, which is a supplement to the fire apparatus access road requirements from chapter 5, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth as we go through the presentation. Also, administrative portion is designating South Metro as the entity with delegated authority from the city to enforce the fire code within the city of Littleton. It designates the fire marshal of South Metro is appointed as the fire code official, and also designates the Regional Board of Appeals as the appellate board to hear matters appealing a decision of the fire code official. So we have a regional Board of Appeals that we are in with an IGA with 5 other fire departments. There's 6 of us total. Around the South Metro jurisdiction, Aurora is one of the bigger entities that are part of that. But all the departments in Douglas County are also included in it. And it's a board of 5 folks that come from varying entities, a fire protection engineering background, a general contracting background, a business owner background and such, to hear matters to appeal from the fire code official decision. So try to have a little bit diverse background in hearing those appeals so that we can get a very solid perspective on how to move forward. I've been with South Metro 16 years, been the fire marshal for 7.5, and we've only had 1 appeal in that time frame. And I don't remember of hearing of any others prior to my tenure for a long time. So we really have a strong philosophy of working with folks and trying to come up with the best case solution for all stakeholders. And then the simple violation penalties and failure to comply sections just to align with city ordinances if we were to have to take any kind of a little bit elevated enforcement action against any property. Continuing in our chapter 1 is also our permits. We have the amending for outdoor assembly event threshold. The code calls for 1,000 planned attendees, and we've elected to propose for 500. The reason for that is we have found when we were using the 1,000 threshold, it is quite the event that's occurring. And we were often being caught behind the ball game, often because our emergency crews were responding to incidents that were occurring that had no permit or any other regulation. So we found roadways being blocked. We found a lot of fire risk hazards of people using cooking appliances that were not compliant in a safe manner, tents that weren't secured properly, those types of things. And so, and then if we were to have a real drastic event, 1,000 people is a lot to be able to help serve in those emergency situations. So through a lot of discussion internally and with our emergency manager and our operations folks, we have proposed the 500 threshold. We felt as an organization that was helping the community reduce the risk and allowing us to provide a elevated level of service if any events were to occur, emergency events during that time. This has been consistent through all of our jurisdictions and has been in place since I believe the 2015 adoption that we've done. So it's been in place for several editions of the code in those areas. We included for permitting temporary membrane structures require permits for air inflated structures. These are bounce houses. I don't know if anyone's familiar. We had the largest bounce house in the world travel through, not in Littleton, but in unincorporated Arapahoe County. This thing was about the size of, I don't know, it was probably close to a city block. It was gigantic. And so, interestingly enough, the fire code has a lot of requirements for air inflated membrane structures, but they don't require a permit. So the theory is that if you have them, you should follow all the code requirements from it. But if that's all you're doing, you don't have to get a permit. And so we felt like that was a elevated risk in our community. We have also had a lot of should say a lot. We've had several cases where we've had bounce houses that were not permitted and were not properly secured to the ground, and wind events have come through. As you're aware, we have quite the number of wind events around here. And so we've had children injured, other people injured, where the bounce house is lifted up and carried them large distances, and then obviously what goes up must come down, unfortunately. So we've had significant injuries with those scenarios.
Is there a size threshold for that? Cause I think of, little bounce houses that parents, especially the last 2 years.
Typically 400 square feet is what we're looking for, so exceeds 400 square feet.
Yeah, that's common in backyards.
Yeah.
Just entertain your children.
Yeah, so for an
That's how Reed babysits his kids.
for
I've seen it.
an individual who just wanna have like a birthday party for their kids in their own individual property in their backyard, would this requirement generally rise to that threshold?
If the bounce house exceeded that 400 square foot threshold,
That's a pretty big bounce house. Yeah, 20 by 20, that's
How much is the
that's
permit?
that's bigger than this.
I had a feeling you were gonna ask that question.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't like, the little 4x4 bounce house that,
Some, they get big.
Yeah, big ones that make sense.
That's so fun.
Any house could be a bounce house.
I think we need to start renting them and testing them out.
It was awesome.
This actually happened in Highlands Ranch, the bounce thing at the Oktoberfest, was up there
At an event.
at
You
an
know,
event.
Right.
Yeah, we've seen them in the events.
That makes that. Yeah. That's
I guess I will say this, so a few years ago,
What was the amount again?
130.
an issue was brought to the city's attention about kind of the differing permit fees and structures that the city and the various permits that were required, as well as South Metro Fire. And I will tell you that Anthony and his department, we worked together in South Metro to kind of refine that process. So having kind of a smaller event was much more affordable for someone, and so I'll give credit to South Metro Fire for your work on that, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we like to take feedback and use it constructively for all the stakeholders as much as we can.
How would parents know, like I remember renting one of those eons ago, in the backyard. How would I have known that I would have to pull a permit for that?
So the responsibility lies on the contractor or the vendor in which you're
Oh,
getting
okay,
the service from.
okay.
And we've run into a couple of scenarios where those vendors have told the homeowner, we basically gave it as an option to get a permit or not. And we tend to get that feedback, and then we'll have a conversation with those vendors just to ensure that we're all on the same page. But that's typically the person that's doing the work is the responsible party for those permits. Yeah. Great question. And then the other part of the fire code under permits that we're proposing amendment to is requiring the permits for construction of buildings and tenant improvements. I know that seems kind of a little contradictory to what we do, but the fire code is built around municipal departments, where the building department gets all of the construction documents, and then the fire departments review them internally as part of the bigger building municipal review process. There's a little bit of a disconnect for those of us that are in special districts that serve these other varying communities, in that the building department does their review and then we do our review. And so it's really critical for us to get those building plans ahead of time with the building department, so that we are looking at all of the applicable fire code provisions to that, and ensuring that all the systems are gonna be properly designed and permittable later that will match the construction features of the building and so forth, so that we aren't going back and having to have difficult conversations. And so that's really just a clarification. It's a practice that we've always been doing for many, many years. It just hadn't been in our earlier versions of our code amendments. So just aligning what our best practices are. And then there's a new section in the 21 code that requires permit valuation to be submitted to the fire department. It's typically associated with a fee schedule. Our fee schedule is built off of a completely different process than permit valuations. So this is just clearing that up and deleting it out of the code for not requiring that. So then general amendments to chapter 5, which is our fire service features chapter. As I mentioned earlier, we are proposing to adopt Appendix D Delta. And so there's varying sections of the chapter 5 provisions that we just adopt where it says must comply with all of these requirements and Appendix D and so forth. So it's just clarifying, adding the Appendix D requirements in the body of the code. We also have a amendment that allows for less restrictive fire apparatus access when buildings are provided with fire sprinklers, depending on the type of system installed. So commercial buildings such as this, it's fully sprinklered in what we refer to as an NFPA 13 system. We would not require 365-degree access to the building. I'm sorry, 360-degree access to the building. We would only require one approved side. So it's basically the side that we feel would be the most appropriate for us to access it for emergency scenarios where a lot of our fire protection features and so forth, such as sprinkler risers and fire alarm design, control panels and such will be located, that we can access that. The body of the code states that you must provide fire department access to 360 degrees of the building within 150 feet. And so sometimes that's pretty restrictive, especially infill lots and so forth. It really brings the size of the building down and just puts a lot of restrictions on developers and builders. So we allow for some exception there because of the building is sprinklered. We assume that that's going to reduce the risk within that building. And then there's another reduction that we only do. We have to have approval for two sides of the building on multifamily, and basically it comes down to really multifamily structures. And the reason for that is the sprinkler systems in those buildings don't protect combustible concealed spaces and attics. So we could still have a very substantial size fire start in those attic spaces and so forth, to where we would need a little bit more readable access to those locations. So that's where that is there. Requires services, this is like a plug and play one, that we require fire apparatus access roadways to be engineered to sustain 80,000 pounds, excuse me. That's our apparatus weight. That's our most restrictive apparatus weight, which is the majority of them. So that's just a simple clarity on that. Another plug and play section is establishing the maximum grade of fire apparatus access roadways to 6%. That is also based off of our fire apparatus manufacturer. We do have probably 98% of our apparatus are built by the same manufacturer. So we're able to reliably utilize their specifications in these roadway design standards. And then establishing fire lane marking provisions in alignment with Model Traffic Code and Appendix D, and another amendment addressing address identification requirements. And that's, I basically took what the current amendment is to the city code and added that. From what I understand, there was a historical purpose behind requiring a more specific address identification requirements. So I wanted to honor that moving forward and keep that consistent with the code. Continuing in chapter 5 is fire flow requirements. It's basically just referencing our adoption of Appendix B Bravo and our fire hydrant referencing Appendix C. Basically, the fire code states that fire flow is basically the amount of water that we need in order to effectively provide fire protection services if the building were to catch fire. And so the fire code basically says that fire flow requirements shall be in accordance with the fire code officials' specifications. Well, then there's a whole appendix of the fire code that really aligns out a very well and historic established fire flow table. So it's based off of square footage and type of construction. So that's why we adopt that in there, and same with Appendix C. Emergency responder communication systems, the fire code is written requires it to be approved by both the fire code official and the building code official. All of our building code officials have delegated that typically to us because that's within our wheelhouse to be able to permit those and inspect them and test them and so forth, along with our emergency radio communication systems. This is also an enhancement for law enforcement, because we do use a public safety band of frequencies, and so when we install these systems in buildings, it also allows for law enforcement to have more reliable communications as well on their radios. Going into chapter 9, which is our fire protection and life safety systems, amendment to allow spare sprinklers to be installed in multi-building complexes. There's the fire code refers to a lot of national standards in how certain systems are designed and installed. And in the fire code, it references NFPA 13, the National Fire Protection Association Standard 13, which is the installation of fire sprinklers essentially in commercial buildings. And in that standard, it states they made an amendment to that standard that said for really it's mostly applicable to multifamily complexes with multiple buildings under the same ownership, that you just have to provide 6 sprinklers for the entire complex. Well, where that's difficult is the purpose of those sprinklers are in place so that if we were to have a fire in a unit that was contained and controlled by that sprinkler, that our fire suppression crews are trained and able to get the proper sprinkler head, a spare sprinkler head, take the one that's already been activated, put the new one in, and put the system back in service so that the rest of the building remains protected and we're keeping people safe throughout the building. So if we have one spot in, let's just say, a 36 unit or 36 building complex, our crews are going to be less likely to find where that's at. It's going to not be consistent, and it's not aligned with how we've been building buildings for decades. So it's just an amendment to just specify that we want to still provide sprinklers in every building like we always have. That was an industry kind of amendment that they got into the body of the code because they wanted to provide a little bit easier alignment for themselves. Continuing aligning an amendment to the building code that John spoke to about not requiring sprinklers in group R3. Our fire code mimics the same exact language requiring it, so we just made an amendment to align with John's amendment. And then there's a new section for standpipe hose connections. Those are the internal piping systems for fire protection. Probably see them in stairwells where there are big pipes that go up and there's appears to be like a hose connection and a valve. It's what we refer to as a standpipe system. The code changed to where they required those hose connections to be on the intermediate landing. However, in our organization, we train all close to 650 firefighters that they are on the main landing. So that's what the code used to require, and then it seems to be about every 3 cycles or so they flip-flop between the intermediate and the main floor landing. As a department, we train, and all of our firefighters are standardized to know and locate those on the main floor, so that's what that amendment's for. Chapter 11 is our existing requirements for our construction requirements for existing buildings. There's a real awkward section in there for fire alarm systems and multifamily buildings. This is just providing a little bit more clarity from the way we perceive it to be, not requiring fire alarm systems in those existing buildings when the egress system allows for an immediate egress to the exterior or an open aired environment. So typically smaller apartment complexes, this would also apply to hotels and so forth, or I guess it'd be motels where the immediate egress is out into an open aired area. Chapter 56, which is our explosives and fireworks. Basically the fire code in its native language bans everything to do with fireworks. And then it says, here are the exceptions. And the exceptions are, there's 5 exceptions. We're here amending to allow for fireworks displays by professionals that are permitted and inspected and oversaw by South Metro, and then allows for the possession, storage, sale, handling, and use of Colorado permissible fireworks per the Colorado Revised Statutes. And then general amendments in the miscellaneous hazardous materials chapters is deletion of provisions regarding bulk storage plans for hazardous materials that also align with typical land use codes in our metro area that prohibit those from happening. So we just delete them out of the fire code to not create any conflicts with that.
Just real quick, Anthony. So about a year ago, in an effort to try to make it a little bit simpler for the enforcement of fireworks.
You just won't let it go, will you?
I won't. I introduced an amendment to just prohibit fireworks. And we had an amendment that came in which allowed for those fireworks allowed by state law, which is kind of sparklers and fountains and things like that. So I like the amendment because it kind of cleans it up a bit, but I mean, it's still allowed. So I see the things out on Twitter that we post saying that, you know, fireworks are prohibited in Littleton. It's like, not exactly true.
How does that clean this up?
So, yeah, does that jive?
Well, no, I mean, you know, in the past, because we're working on, like, and I don't know if Anthony mentioned it, we're in the 2009 IFC here in Littleton. So in 2009, we referenced things like 1.3G, 1.4G, which it means nothing to anyone other than probably Anthony, because he's smart and we're not. But
That's probably a stretch.
the ability for us to effectively go out, unless it's literally leaving the ground and exploding, the ability, not to say that Doug is going to offer up his folks to be doing patrols other than those mortars, the ability for whether it's South Metro or for our PD to discern that that's, you know, 50 milligrams or not, is pretty limited. So other than that real nuisance property who's doing, you know, kind of the mortars at night, really haven't had a kind of a strong showing in terms of doing that enforcement. So it cleans it up a bit for me, at least as an attorney when I'm looking at it. But the actual effect of prohibiting fireworks and making some kind of uniform, you know, kind of Arapahoe County ban, if you will, is not there. And obviously Centennial is probably doing the same thing. I mean, I think they still allow for fireworks that are allowed by state law.
I
don't know if
believe
you can-
so. I know Greenwood and Cherry Hills prohibit all fireworks regardless. I think Centennial still allows municipal state fireworks, and I'd have to look at all the other ones. That is one that's very unique to the city in meeting their constituents' perspectives. So we proposed allowing them. We're not opposed to prohibiting them as well. Like I said, the body of the code prohibits them all outright. So that's a pretty easy. It's one less amendment.
So we're more in compliance now? We wanted to be in compliance with the state and
We're in
Aren't we
compliance with what, I mean, the International Fire Code, I haven't looked at 2021, but it says, you know, or as allowed by your local jurisdiction, I think is kind of how it reads. And so we've kind of cleaned it up to say as allowed by state law, and we've cited to the applicable state statute. So
It's really such a joke, though. I mean, I hate to say that. Because you can say, oh, no fireworks are permitted in Littleton. Oh, but just go right next door, you know, in the county next door. They've got their big tent up selling all kinds of fireworks. So,
It's
it's
a
okay to
challenge.
sell them but not use them. That it doesn't make sense.
no. It's like, how do you enforce
In
it?
the last week of June.
It's just,
It's a time-honored tradition. What are you talking?
It is a difficult
We're
time
gonna find one of those
for us,
priorities
for sure.
I know it is. It's kind of infuriating, actually.
And this is why we used to, even in old South Metro's amendments, we did have a weird definition and so forth. And this was one of the things I wanted to clean up to just align with state statutes, and they have clear definitions in there of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so that way we're consistent in that manner, and that's essentially the language we proposed. And I'm glad Reed supports it.
So is the county more restrictive than the state statute?
No, the counties follow the state statutes as well.
Okay.
I would say there'd be, depending on if there are fire bans, depending on the level of restriction, that would
Yes.
prohibit all fireworks other than professional, so it just depends on.
And that's the other way to curb some of that is to adopt an ordinance for fire bans. And then when you go into the various stages,
Right.
you can prohibit those uses. And that's also the counties, that's what they do as well.
And we have done that recently, we
Yeah.
have an ordinance which will allow us to follow various counties.
This seems to be the most realistic. I mean, why some people would love to have a complete ban on fireworks from an enforcement standpoint, that doesn't seem entirely, It'll
Not
be
as
enough
realistic.
officers
Realistic.
who can do that, or,
No.
you know, firefighters going around the hosing people down.
Bookmobile could go up there.
Our attorney provides us direction not to do that.
Recommends against that.
Yeah.
Just a recommendation.
Yeah, but it's legal counsel, right?
Eh, you-
That was a joke for you.
Hey.
How many calls?
Hey, you picked on me quite a bit in the last.
Choose to listen to what we want to.
How many calls did you have on 4th of July for illegal firework?
Oh gosh, I would have to go back, but I will
Doesn't-
say
he
that
doesn't wanna
this
go
year,
back.
I don't wanna remember it, last year, or this year was one of the more busier years we've had in quite some time. And more substantial, fire incidents occurring from fireworks and so forth. It
Did
was,
notice that in the past point out.
it was about a 14.5 hour day for me specifically, and a little bit longer for my team, so. Yeah, I got home about 4:45 in the morning, and we were just running back-to-back fires, whether they were grass fires or house fires, and so forth. So it was one of the more eventful years for sure.
Were they all in South Bomar?
Aberdeen Village.
They were loud over
there.
Okay, well, continuing on, general amendments to Appendix B Bravo, our fire flow. The fire code, is in the body of the code has gone a little bit beyond our comfort level for, reducing the amount of fire flow required in fully sprinklered buildings. They actually the code actually grants up to 75% reduction, which then drives the number of hydrants available and so forth. And so from our experience, that's a little much for the average building. You could end up with a fairly sizable building with one hydrant that we're relying to work 100% of the time and only provide a very reduced volume of water. Although we do see that sprinkler systems are reliable about 98 to 99% of the time, there's still opportunities for when that failure may occur, and for us to really create a significant reduction in our available resources is not something we're quite comfortable with. With that being said, we do allow for 50% maximum decreases in our what I refer to as the NFPA 13 systems, and then 25% decrease for our multifamily and our single family homes that are provided with sprinklers. So we do still provide a pretty substantial reduction, but not quite as much as the code. So that's essentially all we're amending is not going to the 75%. These look like a lot. They're very they repeat a lot from the Chapter 5 such. So it's just aligning Chapter 5 with the 80,000 pounds, our maximum grade of 6%. We have a section in there that was more restrictive on the roadway width. So basically it said any roadway that has a fire hydrant adjacent to it, the roadway width needs to be a minimum of 26 feet. We are still comfortable with the Chapter 5 requirements of 20 feet with some exceptions. So that's we delete that section to not be as restrictive. Then we we provide direction on the turnaround provision. So when you have a fire apparatus access roadway that exceeds 150 feet in distance, you're required to provide a turnaround that's designed and accepted by the fire district. What we find most of the times is the fire code is more restrictive than what city roadway design standards are, which provides a pretty big burden on developers and such. So we just align ourselves with the city roadway standards. So if there's a conflict from what the code says and the city standards, we'll go with the city standards. So that's all that section is for. Establishes the fire apparatus access roadway markings, which is just fire lanes. We align again with the model traffic code so that they can be enforced. Lines definitions within Appendix D for better. So there's a couple of sections that there's one section that had a strong definition for fire aerial apparatus, which is our big ladder trucks. And then there's another section that is still applicable to that, but there's no strong definition with that. So we just copied and pasted the one that had a strong definition to put it in the other one so that it's very clear what we're trying to accomplish. There's an exception, we added an exception, well, we modified the existing exception for high-rise buildings, again, for those aerial apparatus access roadways, where there were, part of that exception allowed for all buildings that met a certain threshold, construction type, fully sprinklered, standpipe systems and such, with roof access for the standpipe. We felt like that would not align well with our operations. We rely heavily on being able to use our aerial apparatus to access rooftop buildings for our low and mid-rise buildings, but it's not applicable in our high-rise buildings. They're too tall, and so our aerial apparatus can't reach the roof.
What's the definition of a high-rise building?
A definition of a high-rise building, are you ready? Is the highest occupiable floor above fire apparatus access roadway that exceeds 75 feet.
Just how many stories?
75.
So it's typically, rule of thumb is 6 to 7 stories depending on the grade. Yep. And depending on where we establish that fire apparatus access roadway. So you could have a building theoretically that has a higher grade in the back, but our apparatus access is gonna be from the front of the building. And so this would be our designated definition for that high-rise building. Occupied penthouses, mechanical penthouses, those types of things are excluded from that definition.
Sleep tonight.
So you could have a building that's 74 feet in height, but the highest, technically the occupiable floor is a penthouse, a mechanical penthouse on the roof that would exceed that 75-foot threshold. We wouldn't account, that's not part of that definition.
Is mechanical penthouse defined in the ULUC?
No, it's not. But I will say that South Metro is involved in all of our pre-plannings for new construction, new buildings, so it's very helpful to have them on the front end.
Thanks.
Sure, no problem. And then there was a requirement that's really goofy that it's written very confusingly that we found many times is misinterpreted. So we just cleared it up by removing the exception and just keeping the main body section of that. And it's been very beneficial to our design community to understand what's trying to be accomplished there. There's even times where our plan reviewers were misinterpreting it and such. So this just provides a lot more clarity. And with that, I am done.
Any questions? No?
There are a lot more pages to this plan.
Okay, you're good.
I'm yours all night.
What's a mechanical penthouse? Was that an HVAC system? or
Oh,
something?
yeah, I apologize.
It could be an
So
elevator in
oftentimes
4 more minutes.
They
Cell
put all
phone
the
roofs,
rooftop
yeah.
units and all the
Electrical, okay.
broilers or anything that can be up on the roof. And that way you keep your occupiable footprint much more marketable.
I looked that up and think I'm gonna be reported to HR.
Computer is locked. Yeah, penthouse is a little misleading.
Something tells me that's only your first.
Quicker than on Friday.
I'm gonna journal that.
Alright, back over to
All right, I assure you, we are approaching the end. So, we did the fire code amendments. There are no amendments proposed for the uniform code for the abatement of dangerous buildings. There are no amendments proposed for the 2020 National Electrical Code. The state adopted it without amendment, and I'm proposing that we do the same. And then finally, language from the code. Says the building official has the authority to grant modifications for individual cases, provided that the building official shall first find that the modification is in compliance with the intent and purpose of the code, and that such modification does not lessen health, accessibility, life and fire safety or structural requirements. So, as you know, you consider these codes, keep in mind that there is flexibility within these codes, and we do try our best to exercise that flexibility, meet the intent, and work with our customers as much as possible to meet the intent more than the letter. And even though these codes will be more restrictive than our 2012 codes, which is just the nature of building codes as they progress, I think our amendments have made them as flexible as possible, and we will continue to do that in accordance with this section that's in all of the codes. So, questions?
discuss this a little bit more, Patrick?
This is more than I want to know.
So next steps, does it have to, anything else that goes back to BBOA for anything, just to?
Yes, so I just would like clarification that we're in agreement to require sprinklers in townhomes. Okay, so I will make that adjustment. We will also make an adjustment to clarify the weeds section. And then take that, either define weeds in a way that does that, or just modify the make an amendment that says weeds and remove the grasses part. And then we will take this to the Building Board of Appeals next month for their review with those couple of changes and a resolution of support to move forward. And we'll put it in ordinance format, and we're scheduled after review of the ordinance and assembly, we're scheduled for October the 4th for a first reading, November the 15th for a second reading, public hearing, and adoption.
Why is there a 6-week gap between the first and the sixth? It's just schedule or?
Just the way the dates fell and public hearing requirements.
Is Rita on vacation
and
again?
notification.
Budget talks and ballot issues.
Getting it on the city council agenda.
SAMA.
Sam's fault.
About Sama.
Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Thank you.
appreciate
A lot of work.
Before I turn it to city manager and city attorney, I just wanna let council know that I got this little poster in my mailbox that says, congratulations, your city is one of the Livability's 2022 top 100 best places to live. I don't know what that top 100 is or whatever, but scan the QR code to figure it out.
Have one. Please sign up, donate money probably.
Any update from the city manager?
No reports. Mayor?
Just
Learn quick, Jim.
Yeah, good job, good job.
one South Suburban, or South Platte Renew.
We did,
So City Council, City of Inglewood, and South Platte Renew are meeting on Thursday at 7:30 over at South Platte Renew, and it is open to the public, but it is not gonna be broadcast, so.
That's it, good.
See everyone
Thanks.
Thursday morning?
I'll be there.
Yeah, we're adjourned.
Alright.